Sometimes, life gives you a second chance when you least expect it. And sometimes, that chance comes wrapped in mystery. Catherine Reeves never imagined that buying an old barn would change everything she thought she knew about her family's past. At 63, Catherine had spent the last 5 years watching her mother succumb to Alzheimer's disease. And now, she was finally free to start over. She bought 40 acres of Wyoming prairie, complete with a weathered red barn, for next to nothing. The place felt right the moment she and her German shepherd, Scout, stepped through those creaking doors. Catherine planned to turn the barn into a pottery studio, but when Scout kept scratching at a set of loose floorboards, she decided to investigate. What she found hidden beneath those old planks wasn't rot or rats. It was a secret that had been waiting 50 years to see the light of day. What would you do if you discovered your entire family history was a lie? Before we get back to it, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, make sure you're subscribed, because I have something very special in store for you tomorrow. The wooden box sat on Catherine's kitchen table like a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode her quiet retirement. She had pulled it from beneath the loose floorboards 3 hours ago and still hadn't found the courage to open it completely. Scout lay at her feet, occasionally lifting his head to study the box with the same intensity that had led her to its discovery. Catherine Reeves had come to Wyoming seeking peace. After 5 long years of watching Alzheimer's steal her mother away, piece by piece, the disease had been cruel in its methodical destruction, erasing memories like a slow fire consuming a library. First, the recent memories went. Catherine's visits, the conversations from the day before. Then, the middle years vanished. Catherine's marriage, her divorce, her career as a high school art teacher. Finally, even the oldest memories faded, leaving behind a woman who would look at Catherine with polite confusion, asking when her daughter was coming to visit. The last few months had been the hardest. Her mother, Emma, would sit by the window of the care facility, waiting for people who would never come, telling stories about relatives Catherine had never heard of. The staff assured Catherine this was normal. Patients often invented family members as their minds tried to fill the widening gaps. But something about her mother's stories had felt different, more detailed, more real than the typical fabrications of Alzheimer's. After the funeral, Catherine sold the family home in Colorado and bought this remote property in Wyoming, sight unseen. 40 acres of rolling prairie stretched between modest hills, broken only by the weathered red barn that had sealed the deal. The structure leaned slightly to the east. The paint, long surrendered to decades of biting winters and blistering summers, was peeling, but the frame was solid. The real estate listing had described it as outbuildings in fair condition, but Catherine saw the potential for the pottery studio she had dreamt of building since she retired. The nearest town, Pine Ridge, was 15 miles to the east, along a gravel road that turned to a rutted track during the spring thaw. The population was 847, according to the welcome sign, though Catherine suspected that number was optimistic. She had driven through it exactly once since buying the property 2 weeks earlier, taking in the obligatory main street lined with brick buildings from the 1920s. A general store, a diner called Mabel's that looked like it hadn't updated its menu since the Eisenhower administration, a post office that doubled as a bus station, and a handful of other businesses that seemed to exist more out of stubbornness than profit. The locals had been polite but distant during her brief shopping trip. It was the kind of measured courtesy small towns reserve for outsiders, friendly enough to avoid rudeness, but cool enough to discourage lingering. Catherine didn't mind. She had come here for solitude, not social connections. Scout padded over to his water bowl, the tags on his collar jingling softly. The German shepherd had been her constant companion through the worst of her mother's decline, seeming to understand when Catherine needed comfort and when she needed space. At 8 years old, he was entering his dignified senior years, content to spend his days exploring the property's endless rabbit trails and prairie dog colonies. That morning, however, Scout had taken an unusual interest in one particular section of the barn floor. Catherine had been measuring the space for her potter's wheels when she noticed him scratching persistently at one particular plank. The wood looked identical to the rest of the floor, but when Catherine knelt to examine it, she found it was loose. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was the wooden box. The box itself was unremarkable. Simple pine, about the size of a shoebox, with plain hinges and a small brass latch. No lock, no identifying marks, just the honest craftsmanship of an era when people built things to last. Catherine had lifted the lid just enough to see old photographs and papers inside before her courage failed her. She'd always considered herself a straightforward person, comfortable with the truth and uneasy with mysteries. 28 years, thoughts of teaching high school art, had taught her to value clarity and directness. But something about this box felt dangerous, as if opening it completely could unleash consequences she wasn't prepared to handle. The afternoon light streamed through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the checkered linoleum. Catherine had spent the morning cleaning and organizing, trying to make the small farmhouse feel like a home. The previous owners had left behind sturdy, unfashionable furniture that suited Catherine just fine. A kitchen table with mismatched chairs, a living room dominated by a stone fireplace, and two bedrooms connected by a bathroom with an antique clawfoot tub you just couldn't find anymore. The house stood about 100 yards from the barn, connected by a dirt path worn down by decades of foot traffic. Catherine had walked that path countless times in the past 2 weeks, each visit revealing new details about the structure she had bought. The barn was larger than it looked from the outside, with a main floor spacious enough for her pottery studio and a loft that could serve as storage or, eventually, a gallery space. But it was the small details that intrigued her most. Someone had taken great care with this barn, adding thoughtful touches that went beyond mere function, like the forged iron hinges on the doors, the carefully fitted joints in the timber frame, and even small carved details on a support post that suggested its builder had taken pride in their work. Catherine reached for the box, then pulled her hand back. Scout lifted his head, watching her with a patient expression that suggested he understood her hesitation. Dogs are good at reading human emotions, and Scout had become particularly attuned to Catherine's moods during the difficult years of her mother's illness. "What do you think, boy?" she asked softly. "Shall we see what secrets we've found?" Scout thumped his tail against the floor once, not quite an enthusiastic wag, but a gentle encouragement. Catherine lifted the lid all the way. The first thing she saw was a formal, sepia-toned photograph, in the style of a studio portrait from the 1940s or early 50s. It showed a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, with dark hair swept back in soft curls and eyes that looked achingly familiar. She wore a simple dress with a sweetheart neckline and held a small bouquet of wildflowers. Her smile was radiant yet somehow hesitant, as if she wasn't sure she deserved such happiness. Beneath the photograph were several others, along with papers and what looked like letters tied with a faded ribbon. Catherine lifted the first photograph to examine it more closely, and her breath caught in her throat. The young woman was identical to Catherine's mother in her wedding photos. Not similar, identical. The same delicate bone structure, the same full lips, the same distinctive widow's peak. But Catherine had looked through all of her mother's photos countless times while sorting through her belongings after the funeral. This was not one of them. Catherine set the photo aside and sifted through the others. The same young woman appeared in several, sometimes alone, sometimes with other people Catherine didn't recognize. In one, she stood beside a tall man with kind eyes and work-roughened hands. In another, she posed with an older couple who might have been her parents, though their expressions seemed stern, almost disapproving. The last photograph in the stack made Catherine's hands tremble. It showed the young woman holding a baby, her face alight with unmistakable maternal love. The baby looked to be only a few weeks old, swaddled in a delicate christening gown. On the back, in careful cursive, someone had written, "Louise and baby Catherine, May 1960. Catherine stared at the inscription until the words blurred. Louise. Her mother's name was Emma Louise Hartwell, before she married Catherine's father. But Catherine had never heard anyone call her mother Louise, and she had certainly never seen this photograph before. May 1960 was the month Catherine was born. She set the photograph down with trembling hands and picked up the letters. The ribbon came undone easily, as if it had been untied and retied many times over the years. The top letter was in her mother's unmistakable handwriting, though the style was younger, more fluid than Catherine remembered from her final years. "My dearest James," the letter began, and Catherine felt the world shift beneath her feet. Her father's name was Robert, not James. He had died when Catherine was 12, but she remembered him clearly. A quiet man who worked for the phone company and spent his evenings reading Western novels in his favorite armchair. Catherine read the first few lines of the letter, her confusion mounting with every word. This was not the voice of the woman who had raised her. Emma, the practical, reserved mother who worked as a bank teller, belonged to the Methodist Church and never spoke of romance or passion. This was someone else entirely, someone who wrote of stolen moments and secret meetings, and a love so powerful it made the everyday world seem pale in comparison. Scout whimpered softly, as if sensing Catherine's distress. She reached down to scratch his ears, grateful for his steady presence. The late afternoon sun had moved across the sky, leaving the kitchen darker than before. Catherine flipped on the overhead light and turned back to the box. Beneath the letters, she found official-looking documents. A birth certificate for one Louise Emma Hartwell, born March 15, 1931. Her mother's birth date, but with the names inverted. Then a marriage certificate, but not to Robert Reeves. It showed that Louise Hartwell had married someone named William Morrison in 1949. Catherine leaned back in her chair, her head spinning. None of this made any sense. Her parents were Robert and Emma Reeves. She had seen their marriage license, their tax returns, their life insurance policies. But these documents suggested a completely different history, one that called into question everything she thought she knew about her own family. The box revealed one more surprise: a small brass key, tarnished with age but still solid. It looked like the kind of key that might open a lockbox or a safe deposit box, though Catherine had no idea what it could possibly unlock. As the sun set behind the rolling hills, Catherine sat surrounded by the scattered contents of the wooden box, feeling as if she had stumbled into someone else's life. The young woman in the photographs looked like her mother, but had a name Catherine had never heard. The letters spoke of a passionate romance with a man who was not her father. The documents suggested legal ties that contradicted everything in Catherine's family records. Scout stood and stretched, then nudged the door to indicate he needed his evening walk. Catherine followed him outside, grateful for the distraction of the familiar routine. The prairie stretched out in every direction, painted purple and gold by the setting sun. Songbirds called from the fence posts, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered with its own wild cry. This was supposed to be her sanctuary, the place where she would finally build the life she had always wanted. Instead, it felt like the center of a mystery she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. But as she watched Scout sniffing at the entrance to the barn, his tail wagging with the same excitement that had led him to discover the box, Catherine realized she might not have a choice. Some secrets, once unearthed, demanded to be understood. Catherine spent a restless night turning over the implications of her discovery. By morning, she had almost convinced herself there must be a reasonable explanation. Maybe Louise was a middle name her mother used when she was young. Maybe the documents were copies of someone else's papers, stored in the barn by a previous owner. Maybe her grief over her mother's death was making her see connections that weren't there. But when she returned to the barn after breakfast, Scout immediately led her to another loose floorboard near the east wall. This one took more effort to lift, but Catherine's resolve had crystallized overnight. If there were more secrets hidden in this building, she intended to find every last one. Beneath the second plank, wrapped in the same oiled cloth, was a single letter written by her mother. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded to a soft brown, but the words were still legible. Catherine read it standing up, in the morning light that streamed through the high barn windows. And with each line her understanding of her family's history crumbled. To my dearest Louise, the letter began. I hope you are well, and that you are finding peace in your new life. I know what we did was for the best, though my heart breaks a little more each day, watching Catherine grow up without knowing the truth of her mother. Catherine's hands began to tremble. She forced herself to read on. She has your eyes and your stubbornness. Yesterday, she spent 3 hours trying to convince me the neighbor's cat was hers, even after I explained a dozen times that cats choose their own families. She reminds me so much of you at that age, so determined to bend the world to her will rather than accept things as they are. The letter was dated September 1965, when Catherine would have been 5 years old. It was signed, "With all my love, Mama." But the handwriting belonged to the woman Catherine had always known as her mother. Catherine sank onto a hay bale, her legs suddenly unsteady. The letter made it plain. Louise was Catherine's biological mother, and the woman who had raised her, Emma, was in fact her grandmother. But why would they have hidden it? And where was Louise now? She read the letter again, searching for clues. Emma wrote that what we did was for the best, and about Louise's new life, suggesting Louise had been sent away for some reason. The tone was loving, but sad, as if the separation had been necessary, but painful for everyone involved. Catherine cast her mind back through her childhood, trying to recall any hint of her true parentage. Her mother, Emma, had always been reserved about their family history. Whenever Catherine asked about relatives, Emma would change the subject or give vague answers about family members who had moved away or died young. Catherine had accepted these explanations without question, as children do, but now they seemed deliberately evasive. There had been no grandparents in Catherine's life, no aunts or uncles, No family reunions. Emma had explained it as the result of a small family, scattered by economic hardship, a common enough story in post-Depression America. But now, Catherine wondered if the isolation had been intentional, designed to prevent questions about her real ancestry. Scout whimpered and pawed at another section of the floor near the barn's back wall. Catherine knelt beside him and found that several boards in this area were loose, covering what looked like a shallow cellar or root storage. Using a crowbar she found among the barn's tools, she pried up enough planks to reveal a wooden box the size of a steamer trunk. The box took both her hands to lift from its hiding place. Inside, Catherine found more photographs, documents, and personal items that painted a picture of Louise's life before she disappeared. School report cards showed excellent grades, a high school diploma, dated 1949, a certificate of completion for a secretarial course, and several photographs of Louise with friends, all of them young women wearing the confident smiles of people who believed the future held limitless possibilities. But the most revealing item was a medical record from Pine Ridge General Hospital, dated May 1960. It documented the birth of a daughter to Louise Emma Hartwell, with no father listed. The attending physician was a Dr. James Patterson, and the record included a handwritten note expressing concerns about family pressure. A social worker had been consulted. Catherine stared at the hospital record, her heart hammering in her chest. This was official confirmation that Louise was her biological mother. But it also raised new questions about the circumstances of her birth and why Louise had been forced to give her up. The location on the record intrigued her. The birth was registered at Pine Ridge General Hospital, the same small town just 15 miles from where she now stood. Had Louise lived here? Was this area tied to her family's story in ways Catherine had never imagined? She spent the rest of the morning examining every item in the box, searching for more clues about Louise's life and disappearance. A diary from 1959 revealed Louise's excitement about her pregnancy, mixed with a growing anxiety about her family's reaction. Entries spoke of keeping the secret and protecting the baby, but didn't specify what Louise was protecting the child from. The final entry, dated just a few weeks before Catherine's birth, was heartbreaking in its uncertainty. Mama says there's only one way to handle this, but I can't bear the thought of giving up my baby. Yet what choice do I have? An unwed mother has no future in this town, and I will not condemn my daughter to bear the shame of my mistakes. Perhaps one day, when she is older, she will understand that everything I did for love. Catherine closed the diary, her throat tight. The woman who raised her, Emma, had done it for love, stepping in to give Catherine a stable home when Louise could not. But Louise, too, had acted out of love, making the painful sacrifice of giving up her daughter to ensure Catherine had a respectable upbringing. The tragedy was that Catherine had grown up never knowing that sacrifice, never understanding the depth of love that had shaped her childhood. Both women had protected her, but in doing so they had also deprived her of the truth of her own identity. Scout found another loose board near the main entrance to the barn, and Catherine's search expanded. Each new discovery added another piece to the puzzle of Louise's life and disappearance. A bundle of letters from someone named James, speaking of a secret relationship and promises to make things right. A train ticket dated June 1960 for Denver, Colorado, and a forwarding address for a boarding house that had likely been torn down decades ago. But it was the final discovery that shattered Catherine's composure entirely. Tucked away under the barn's main support beam, she found a small wooden box containing a birth certificate, her own birth certificate. But this was not the document she had always known. This one listed her mother as Louise Emma Hartwell and her father as James William Morrison. Catherine had never heard the name James Morrison before today. According to the birth certificate she'd grown up with, her father was Robert Reeves, the quiet telephone company lineman who had died when she was 12. But this document suggested Robert Reeves had adopted her, giving her his name and legal legitimacy while hiding her true parentage. The revelation left Catherine feeling as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Not only was the woman she knew as her mother actually her grandmother, but the man she knew as her father was no relation to her at all. Her entire family history was a carefully constructed fiction designed to hide the circumstances of her birth. As the afternoon wore on, Catherine sat surrounded by the remnants of Louise's secret life, trying to process the magnitude of what she had discovered. Every assumption about her identity had been proven wrong. Every family story had been revealed as a cover-up. Even her name might not be real. The birth certificate listed her as Catherine Louise Morrison, not Catherine Emma Reeves. Scout settled beside her with a contented sigh, apparently pleased to have his archaeological work complete. But Catherine realized that uncovering these secrets was only the beginning. Now she had to understand why Louise had disappeared and what had happened to her in the more than 50 years since Catherine's birth. Most importantly, she had to know if Louise was still alive somewhere, perhaps still believing that the daughter she'd given up was better off not knowing the truth of her origins. The thought that she might have a mother out there, a woman who loved her enough to sacrifice everything for her well-being, filled Catherine with a mixture of hope and terror that stole her breath. The Pine Ridge Public Library occupied a Carnegie building that had seen better decades. Built of red brick with white stone trim, it stood on Main Street between the post office and a hardware store that looked like it had been shuttered since the first Bush administration. Catherine pushed open the heavy oak doors, Scout waiting patiently on the front steps, as she'd trained him to do. The interior smelled of dust, old paper, and the lemon oil used to polish the reading tables. A few elderly patrons were scattered among the shelves, and behind the circulation desk, a woman in her 70s looked up with the practiced smile of someone who had spent most of her adult life assisting library visitors. "Good morning," the librarian said. "I'm Mrs. Patterson. How can I help you?" Catherine introduced herself and explained that she had recently purchased property outside of town and was interested in learning about the area's history. Mrs. Patterson's smile didn't waver, but Catherine noticed a subtle shift in her posture, a slight stiffening that suggested a weary familiarity. "Ah, yes, the old Morrison place," Mrs. Patterson said. "That property has quite a history. Are you planning to farm it?" The Morrison place. Catherine's heart quickened. The name from her newfound birth certificate. "I was told it belonged to someone named Henderson." "Well, yes. The Hendersons were the most recent owners, but before that, it was part of the Morrison farm. It was a rather large operation back in the day. James Morrison was one of the most successful farmers in the county until—" Mrs. Patterson stopped abruptly, as if catching herself before she said too much. "Until what?" Catherine asked gently. Mrs. Patterson glanced around the empty library and leaned forward conspiratorially. "There was some kind of scandal back in the early 50s. I was just a girl then, but I remember my parents whispering about it. Something about the Morrison boy being involved with the Hartwell girl." Catherine's hands tightened into fists at her sides. The Hartwell girl? Louise Hartwell. Pretty, but she got herself into trouble, if you take my meaning. The talk was that James Morrison was involved, though he was a married man at the time. His wife was my aunt's best friend, so we heard all sorts of stories. When Louise disappeared, the rumor was that James helped her get out of town to avoid the scandal. Mrs. Patterson straightened up, seeming to realize she had said more than she'd intended. But that's all ancient history now. Water under the bridge. What kind of historical information were you looking for, specifically? Catherine asked to see property records and newspaper archives from the early 1950s. Mrs. Patterson directed her to a file cabinet containing local ledgers and a microfilm reader, loaded with back issues of the Pine Ridge Gazette. Catherine spent the next 2 hours poring over dusty documents and squinting at grainy newspaper microfilm, piecing together a picture of her biological parents' lives. Property records confirmed that James Morrison had owned a large farm, which included the land where Catherine's barn now stood. The Morrison farm was sold off in parcels throughout the 1950s, with James apparently liquidating his assets piece by piece before vanishing from the county records entirely. The newspaper archives revealed more. In May 1950, the Pine Ridge Gazette had reported on the wedding of James Morrison to Sarah Fleming, the daughter of the town banker. The wedding was described as the social event of the season, with photographs showing a handsome man in his late 20s and a beautiful blonde woman surrounded by flowers and well-wishes. But by 1952, the tone of the coverage related to Morrison had shifted. Catherine found a brief mention of struggles at the Morrison farm and speculation about financial trouble. Then, in June 1953, a stark obituary announced the death of James Morrison in a car accident outside Denver, Colorado. He was survived by his widow, Sarah. No children were mentioned. The timing troubled Catherine. If James Morrison died in 1953, he couldn't have had a hand in her upbringing. Yet she'd found clear evidence he was her biological father. What had happened in the years between her birth and his death? Louise Hartwell's name appeared only once in the newspaper archives Catherine could access. A brief mention in the high school graduation list of 1949. After that, nothing. It was as if Louise had simply vanished from the local record, leaving no trace of her existence after she finished school. Catherine requested access to birth and death records at the county courthouse, an imposing brick building that dominated the town square in Pine Ridge. The clerk, a tired-looking woman named Janet, was helpful but apologetic about the limitations of the archived records. "We had a fire in the basement storage back in '87, Janet explained. "We lost a lot of records from the 40s and 50s. What we have left is organized, but it's not complete." Still, Janet managed to produce a birth certificate for Louise Emma Hartwell, confirming the information Catherine had found in the barn. Born March 15, 1931 to Robert and Margaret Hartwell of Pine Ridge. The father was a farmer, the mother a homemaker. There was no mention of siblings. "Do you have any death records for the Hartwell family?" Catherine asked. Janet checked her files and found death certificates for Robert Hartwell in 1954 and Margaret Hartwell in 1956. Both had died relatively young, Robert at 51 of a heart attack, Margaret at 48 of cancer. There was no death certificate for Louise. "If she died somewhere else, the record might not be in our files," Janet explained. "Or if she married and changed her name. We wouldn't necessarily have that information unless she died here in the county." Catherine left the courthouse with more questions than answers. The official records confirmed that Louise had existed and that her parents had died in the mid-1950s. But they offered no clues as to what had happened to Louise herself after Catherine's birth. On the way back to her property, Catherine noticed something she hadn't seen on her previous trips into town. About 5 miles from Pine Ridge, A dirt road branched off to the north, marked by a weather-beaten sign that read, Hartwell Cemetery. Catherine turned onto the road, following it for a mile through rolling pastures until she reached a small pioneer cemetery enclosed by a sagging wire fence. The cemetery held perhaps 50 graves, most dating from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Catherine found the Hartwell family plot near the back. It was marked by a modest granite headstone inscribed Robert Hartwell, 1903 to 1944, and Margaret Hartwell, 1928 to 1956. Between them was space for a third grave, but it remained empty. The missing grave unsettled Catherine more than she could explain. If Louise had died, wouldn't she have been buried with her parents? The empty space suggested that someone had expected Louise to come home eventually, that her disappearance had been seen as temporary, not permanent. As Catherine stood in the silent cemetery, with scouts sniffing at the worn headstones, she realized her investigation was only just beginning. Official records could tell her when people were born and when they died, but they couldn't explain why a young woman would vanish so completely that not even her own family's cemetery held a place for her. More troubling was the growing certainty that Louise's disappearance had not been voluntary. The diary entries Catherine had found suggested someone torn between love for her child and pressure from her family, not someone planning to start a new life elsewhere. Something had happened to force Louise away from Pine Ridge, and Catherine suspected that something had been powerful enough to keep her away for more than 60 years. Catherine returned to the barn with renewed determination, convinced that more secrets were hidden within its weathered walls. Scout seemed to share her sense of purpose, methodically investigating every corner with the rigor of a professional detective. It was Scout who led her to the old toolbox in the loft, his persistent whining prompting Catherine to climb the ladder and examine what looked like nothing more than forgotten farm equipment. The toolbox was heavy, made of the kind of wood and metal from an era when tools were built to last for generations. Beneath a layer of rusted wrenches and antique screwdrivers, Catherine found what Scout's keen nose had detected: a hand-drawn and carefully detailed map of the surrounding area, showing the property lines as they existed in 1948. The map revealed that Catherine's 40 acres had once been a small part of a much larger Hartwell estate. According to the hand-drawn boundaries, the Hartwell family had owned nearly 200 acres of prime farmland, stretching from the hills in the west to the creek that ran along what was now the county road. The Morrison farm lay adjacent to the north, creating a substantial agricultural operation that would have made both families quite prosperous for the region. Catherine studied the map in the afternoon light, slanting through the loft windows, tracing the boundary lines with her finger. Someone had marked several parcels with dates and initials, apparently tracking the gradual sale of the Hartwell land throughout the early 1950s. The largest parcel had been sold to M.W. in 1952, while smaller parcels went to different buyers in the following years. The systematic selling of the Hartwell property suggested financial pressure or a family crisis, not the typical gradual transition of farming families passing land to the next generation. Something had forced the Hartwells to liquidate their assets quickly, and that something had coincided with Louise's pregnancy and disappearance. Catherine climbed down from the loft and drove back to Pine Ridge, this time heading straight for the office of Tom Brennan, whose name she had found on a business card tucked into one of the library's local history books. Brennan worked out of a small office above the hardware store, offering genealogical research and historical consulting to tourists interested in tracing their family roots in the area. Tom Brennan was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and a deep tan from spending too much time outdoors. His office was cramped, but organized, with filing cabinets lining every wall and a computer that looked like it had been state-of-the-art sometime during the Clinton administration. Catherine Reeves, she introduced herself. I bought the old Morrison place and I'm trying to research the history of the property. Tom's expression lit up with genuine interest. Ah, that property has some stories to tell. I've been researching families in this area for 20 years, and the Hartwell-Morrison connection is one of the more intriguing puzzles I've come across. What can you tell me about it? Tom pulled a thick folder from one of his files and spread several documents across his desk. The Hartwells were among the most successful farming families in the county during the 1930s and 40s. Robert Hartwell had inherited good land from his father and expanded the operation considerably by the time his daughter Louise was born. Catherine's heart quickened at the mention of Louise's name. What happened to the family? That's where the story gets interesting, Tom said, leaning back in his chair. By all accounts, Louise was a bright, capable young woman. Good student, popular with her classmates, seemed destined for a solid future. But around 1950, things started to go wrong for the Hartwell family. Tom showed Catherine copies of legal documents he had obtained from various county offices. Mortgage records, tax assessments, and property transfer documents painted a picture of a family under increasing financial strain. Robert Hartwell started borrowing against his land in 1950, Tom explained. That wasn't unusual for farmers. They often used land as collateral for operating loans. But the amounts were larger than normal, and the timing suggests he was dealing with some kind of crisis. What kind of crisis? That's the mystery. There are no records of crop failures or livestock diseases that would explain the sudden financial hardship. But by 1951, Hartwell was selling off pieces of his land to meet his obligations. The biggest piece went to a development company called Mountain West Holdings. Catherine remembered the MW notations on the map. Who owned Mountain West Holdings? Tom's expression grew thoughtful. That's where things get murky. The company was incorporated in Colorado, but ownership records from that era are hard to access. What I can tell you is that Mountain West Holdings bought up a good deal of land in this area in the early 50s, often from families that seemed to be under financial duress. And Louise Hartwell disappeared sometime in 1952, according to local sources. The official story was that she'd gone to Denver to find work, but no one I ever spoke to remembers her leaving or heard from her after that. Her parents never spoke of her again, and when they died in the mid-1950s, there was no mention of Louise in the obituaries or wills. Tom leaned forward, lowering his voice. Between you and me, I think there was a scandal involving Louise and James Morrison. He was a married man. She was a young, single woman. And small towns in the 1950s didn't handle that kind of situation with much tolerance. I suspect Louise was encouraged to leave town to avoid embarrassment for both families. Encouraged by whom? That's the question, isn't it? Someone with enough influence to put pressure on both the Hartwell and Morrison families. Someone who could arrange for Louise to disappear quietly and for the land to be sold quickly to cover any financial incentives. Catherine thought of the Mountain West Holdings connection. Do you think this development company was involved somehow? Tom nodded slowly. It's possible. Companies like that often had ways of acquiring land from families who couldn't afford to keep it. If Louise's pregnancy created a scandal that threatened the reputations of both families, someone may have offered to make the problem go away in exchange for favorable real estate deals. As Catherine drove back to her property, Tom's words echoed in her mind. The idea that Louise's disappearance could have been orchestrated by outside interests added a sinister dimension to what she had initially considered a family tragedy. But it also explained some of the puzzling details she had uncovered. The systematic land sales, the complete erasure of Louise from local records, and the careful coordination required to hide Catherine's true parentage. That evening, Catherine spread all of her findings across the kitchen table, trying to assemble a coherent timeline. Louise became pregnant sometime in late 1951. By early 1952, her family was selling off land to cover mysterious financial pressures. Catherine was born in May of 1952, and soon after, Louise vanished. Within 3 years, Louise's parents were dead, and the remaining Hartwell land had been sold. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. Someone had orchestrated Louise's removal from Pine Ridge and ensured she never returned to claim her inheritance or her daughter. But who held that kind of power in a small Wyoming town? And what did they gain by destroying the Hartwell family? Catherine was studying the property map when Scout started barking at something outside. She glanced out the kitchen window and saw headlights approaching up her gravel driveway. At this time of night, unexpected visitors were unusual enough to put her on edge. The vehicle was an expensive-looking SUV with Colorado plates. The man who stepped out was tall and well-dressed, probably in his 50s, with a confident air that suggested he was used to getting what he wanted. He approached Catherine's front door as Scout watched him warily, not with the friendly tail wagging he usually reserved for visitors. "Ms. Reeves," the man said, when Catherine opened the door. "My name is Marcus Webb. I represent a real estate development firm that has an interest in your property." Catherine studied his face, noting the perfect teeth and expensive haircut. "I'm not interested in selling." "I understand completely," Webb said with a rehearsed smile. "It's a beautiful piece of property, with a great deal of potential. But I think you might be interested in what we have to offer. Mountain Vista Development is planning a major resort and conference center in this area, and your property would be a key piece of the project." Mountain Vista Development wasn't Mountain West Holdings, but it was close enough to make Catherine's heart race. "I just bought this place. I'm not thinking about selling." "Of course not. But market conditions can change quickly, especially for someone who isn't familiar with the challenges of maintaining a rural property. Water rights, mineral rights, tax assessments. There are a lot of complexities that can make ownership a burden for newcomers." There was something in Webb's tone that made his words sound less like helpful advice and more like a veiled threat. Catherine kept her expression neutral. "I'll manage." "I'm sure you will. But if your circumstances should change, please keep us in mind. We are prepared to be very generous." Webb handed her a business card with embossed lettering. "And Ms. Reeves, it might be best to be careful what you go digging for in old barns. Sometimes the past is best left undisturbed." Webb walked back to his SUV and drove away, leaving Catherine standing in her doorway with Scout growling softly at her side. The visit felt like a warning disguised as a business proposal, and the timing, just hours after her conversation with Tom Brennan, suggested that her investigation into Louise's disappearance had attracted unwanted attention. Catherine examined Webb's business card under the kitchen light. Mountain Vista Development was based in Denver, with an address in one of the city's most expensive business districts. The company logo featured stylized mountains and the slogan, "Building the Communities of Tomorrow." She turned the card over and found handwritten numbers on the back, what looked like a property assessment, and a dollar figure that took her breath away. Webb's generous offer was nearly 3 times what she had paid for the property just 2 weeks before. Someone wanted her land very badly, and Catherine suspected it had nothing to do with resort development and everything to do with keeping Louise's secrets buried forever. Catherine spent a sleepless night replaying Marcus Webb's visit and his thinly veiled threats. By dawn, she had decided that his attempt to intimidate her had backfired, Instead of scaring her away from the investigation, it had convinced her that she was getting close to something important. People didn't make midnight visits to threaten landowners unless they had secrets worth protecting. After breakfast, she returned to the barn with Scout and resumed her systematic search. If Webb was worried about what she might find, then there must be more evidence hidden in the building. This time she approached her search more methodically, examining every support beam, every loose floorboard, and every corner where something could have been concealed. It was Scout who made the crucial discovery, digging persistently at what appeared to be a simple dirt floor near an old manger. When Catherine knelt to investigate, she noticed the earth in that spot was softer than the surrounding ground, as if it had been disturbed and then replaced. Using a small trowel from the barn's collection of tools, she carefully excavated the area. About 18 inches down, the shovel struck something that was not earth. Catherine cleared away the soil to reveal a tin box, roughly the size of a cigar box, wrapped in oilcloth. Unlike the wooden chests she had found before, this container had been sealed with wax along its edges, suggesting that whoever buried it had been particularly concerned with preserving its contents. Inside the tin box, Catherine found a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The paper was different from the previous correspondence she'd discovered, heavier, with an elegant letterhead that read Morrison Ranch in embossed script. The handwriting was masculine, fluid yet decisive, and the letters were all addressed to "My dearest Louise." Catherine sat on a hay bale and began to read, immediately drawn into an intimate correspondence that laid bare the depths of James Morrison's feelings for Louise Hartwell. The letters spanned nearly 2 years, from early 1959 to the spring of 1961, documenting a passionate but troubled relationship. "My dearest Louise," the first letter began, "I cannot stop thinking about our conversation yesterday. You are right to say that our situation is impossible, but my heart refuses to accept the logic of it. I know I have no right to ask you to wait for me, yet I cannot imagine a future without you in it." The early letters revealed a man torn between duty and desire. James wrote of his unhappy marriage to Sarah, describing it as a union arranged by their families for business, not for love. He spoke of Louise as the light in his darkness, the only person who understood his dreams of modernizing his ranch and building something that would last. But as the correspondence progressed, the tone grew more urgent, more worried. James wrote of the pressure from Louise's parents to end the affair, of threats to his own family's reputation, and of mysterious financial hardships that seemed designed to force both their families to bend to someone else's agenda. "Louise, my love," he wrote in a letter dated March 1960, "I fear we are being manipulated by forces neither of us fully understands. Your father came to see me yesterday, not with the anger I expected, but with the resignation of a man who has been given an ultimatum he cannot refuse. He spoke of debts that must be paid, and consequences that would ruin our families if certain arrangements are not honored." Catherine's hands trembled as she read a letter dated just 2 weeks before she was born. James wrote of his determination to protect Louise and their unborn child, even if it meant sacrificing everything he had built. He promised to find a way for them to be together, to create a life far from the forces that sought to control them. "I have been investigating the source of these pressures," James detailed, "and I believe I now understand who is behind our troubles. The Mountain West Holdings Company, which has been buying up distressed properties in the county, is not what it seems. I've traced its ownership through several shell corporations, and I believe it is controlled by interests who have been manipulating land prices and creating artificial financial crises to acquire valuable property below market value. The next letter was more specific. My darling, I have discovered that Mountain West Holdings is ultimately controlled by the Webb family from Denver. Marcus Webb's father, Harrison Webb, has been using hired agents to create scandals and financial pressure, forcing families to sell their land cheap. Our situation is not unique. They have done this to at least 3 other families in the county in the last 5 years. Catherine held her breath. Marcus Webb, the man who had visited her just the night before, was the son of the person James Morrison had identified as the architect of Louise's downfall. The connection was no coincidence. The Webb family had been manipulating events in Pine Ridge for over 60 years, and they were still trying to control the outcome. The final letters in the bundle revealed James's growing desperation. He wrote of Louise's pregnancy becoming too obvious to hide, of the mounting pressure from both their families to resolve the situation, and of his own plans to expose the Webb's manipulations to state authorities. The last letter, dated May of 1961, almost exactly 1 year after Catherine's birth, was heartbreaking in its finality. My dearest Louise, by the time you read this, I will be gone. They have made it clear that my presence in Pine Ridge endangers not only us, but our daughter. I have made arrangements for Catherine to be raised safely by your mother, where she will have the stability and respectability we cannot offer. I am leaving proof of the Webb family's crimes with someone I trust. Someday, when it is safe, the truth will come out. Until then, know that my love for you and our daughter will never diminish, no matter the distance between us. Catherine set the letter down with shaking hands. James Morrison had not abandoned Louise and their child. He had been forced away to protect them, and his death in a car crash outside Denver in 1963, it had not been an accident, either. Given what Catherine now knew of the Webb family's methods, she suspected James's death had been arranged to ensure his silence forever. The tin box held one more crucial piece of evidence: a small key tied to a slip of paper with an address in Denver. The address was for a safe deposit box at the First National Bank of Colorado, and the key bore the bank's distinctive logo. James Morrison had hidden his proof somewhere, and he had left Louise the means to find it. But Louise had never been able to use the key, because she had been prevented from ever returning to Pine Ridge to retrieve it. As Catherine sat in the dusty barn, surrounded by the remnants of a love story destroyed by greed and manipulation, she realized she held the means to bring down the very same forces that had shattered her parents' lives. The Webb family had spent 60 years believing their secrets were safe, but they had made one crucial mistake. They had allowed Catherine to buy the very property where all the proof was buried. Catherine drove to Denver the next morning, leaving Scout in the care of Tom Brennan. The 3-hour drive gave her time to process the magnitude of her discovery and plan her approach. The address from the tin box led her to a massive bank building downtown, one that had likely been impressive in the 1950s, but now looked tired and institutional among Denver's gleaming modern skyscrapers. The bank manager, a woman named Patricia Gonzalez, was initially skeptical of Catherine's request to access a safe deposit box that had been dormant for more than 60 years. But when Catherine produced the key and explained her connection to James Morrison, Ms. Gonzalez agreed to look up the account records. "This is highly unusual," Ms. Gonzalez admitted, as she led Catherine down to the vault level. "Most inactive boxes are eventually turned over to the state as unclaimed property, but this one was prepaid for a century, with specific instructions that access should only be granted to Louise Hartwell or her direct descendants." The safe deposit box was larger than Catherine expected, about the size of a briefcase. Inside, she found documents that made her hands tremble as she recognized their significance. James Morrison had been meticulous, documenting the Webb family's crimes, collecting evidence that would have been devastating if it had been released to authorities in the 1950s. There were signed affidavits from ranchers who had been pressured to sell their land after mysterious financial hardships. Photographs of men Catherine didn't recognize meeting with bank officials and county assessors. Most damning of all were copies of correspondence between Harrison Webb and various local officials, detailing payments made to ensure favorable property appraisals and tax foreclosures. But it was the hospital bracelet that stole Catherine's breath away. A tiny pink band, the kind given to newborns, with Baby Hartwell printed in faded ink and a date that matched Catherine's birth. Attached to the bracelet was a handwritten note from James Morrison. Louise wore this until they took her away. She wanted you to have it when you were old enough to understand. Catherine stared at the bracelet, overwhelmed by the realization that Louise had kept this token of their connection, even as she was forced to give her daughter up. The bracelet represented the only physical link between Catherine and the mother she had never known, proof that Louise's love had survived the separation and the time. Among the documents, Catherine found what appeared to be a diary or journal written in Louise's careful hand. The entries began in June of 1960, shortly after Catherine's birth, and continued sporadically for several years. Reading Louise's words was like hearing her mother's voice for the first time. "They came for me today," the first entry began. "Dr. Peterson said it was for my own good, that I was suffering from nervous exhaustion and needed rest. But I know the truth. They are taking me away because I refused to forget my daughter and James." Mother cried as they put me in the car, but she didn't try to stop them. She said it was the only way to protect Catherine from the scandal. The entries revealed that Louise had been committed to the Colorado State Psychiatric Hospital, not because she was mentally ill, but because it was a convenient way to ensure her silence. The Webb family had arranged her commitment through a doctor they controlled, using her out-of-wedlock pregnancy and her inappropriate relationship as evidence of mental instability. "I am not crazy," Louise wrote in an entry from August 1960. "The other women here are truly sick, but I am here only because I loved unwisely and bore a child out of wedlock. The doctors ask me about my delusions, but the only delusion is that there is justice in a world where money can buy silence and separate you from the people you love most." Catherine read through years of entries, watching Louise's hope gradually give way to resignation as she realized her imprisonment was indefinite. Louise wrote of receiving the news of James's death in 1963, of being told that Catherine was thriving with her adoptive family, but also of the slow erosion of hope that she would ever be reunited with her child. "I have stopped asking when I can go home," Louise wrote in 1965. "Dr. Peterson makes it clear that my release depends on my accepting that my previous life was a symptom of illness, that my love for James and my desire to raise Catherine were manifestations of an unstable mind. But I cannot speak those words, because it would make our love a lie and our daughter a mistake." The later entries, from the early 1970s, showed Louise's growing understanding that she would never be released as long as she held on to the delusions about her past life. But they also revealed a woman who had found ways to survive, and even to help others, within the system that held her captive. "I work in the hospital library now," Louise wrote in 1973. "The head librarian is kind and allows me to help other patients write letters to their families. I cannot write to Catherine. They monitor my mail too closely. But I can help others maintain the connections I have lost. It is something." Catherine wiped tears from her eyes as she read the final entry, dated December 1979. Catherine would have been 19 then, old enough to make her own decisions. I sometimes imagine her now, going to college, learning to think for herself, perhaps questioning the stories she was told about her origins. I have kept a record of everything that happened to us, hidden in places they cannot find. One day, if she comes looking for the truth, she will find it. Until then, I wait, I hope, and I remember what it was like to hold her in my arms. Catherine closed the journal and sat in the silent viewing room of the bank, processing the magnitude of Louise's sacrifice. Her mother had spent decades institutionalized rather than deny her love for Catherine and James. She had endured confinement and separation rather than accept the Webb family's version of events. But Louise had also been strategic. Among the documents in the box, Catherine found evidence that Louise had been corresponding with lawyers and advocates, slowly building a case for her release. There were records of legal challenges to her commitment, appeals to state authorities, and even communications with journalists interested in exposing abuses in the mental health system. The most recent document was dated only 5 years ago, a letter from the hospital administration informing Louise's legal representative that she had passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 83. She had spent 53 years committed, never once admitting to the delusions that had justified her confinement. As Catherine gathered the documents to return them to the box, she found one last item that made her gasp. It was a photograph of herself, apparently taken without her knowledge sometime in the last decade. She was walking out of the Colorado high school where she taught, carrying her familiar canvas tote bag and wearing the blue sweater she had bought the previous year. On the back of the photograph, in Louise's careful script, were the words, "My beautiful daughter, living the life I always wanted for you. I love you, Catherine, and I am so proud of the woman you have become." Louise had been watching her. Somehow, despite her confinement, Louise had found ways to keep track of Catherine's life, to ensure that the daughter she had been forced to abandon was safe and happy. The knowledge that her mother had been thinking of her, watching over her from a distance, was a strange and potent mix of pain and comfort. Catherine now understood that Louise's death 5 years ago had set something in motion. Perhaps it was the release of information that led to her own inexplicable decision to buy the Wyoming property. Perhaps Louise had arranged with her legal representatives for Catherine to be guided toward the truth she had spent decades preserving. But Catherine also understood that the Webb family's crimes were far from over. Marcus Webb's visit to her property was proof that they were still actively working to suppress the evidence of their family's history. They had silenced James Morrison and imprisoned Louise Hartwell, but they had made one crucial mistake. They had allowed Catherine to survive. Catherine returned to Wyoming with Louise's hospital bracelet in her pocket and a burning determination to expose the Webb family's crimes. But when she arrived at Tom Brennan's office to pick up Scout, she found Tom pacing nervously around his cluttered workspace, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a palpable agitation. "Catherine, thank God you're back," Tom said, before she'd even closed the door. "We need to talk. After you left this morning, I started digging deeper into my grandfather's records, trying to find more about the Louise Hartwell case." Scout ran to Catherine with obvious relief, but even he seemed to sense the tension in the air. Tom motioned for Catherine to sit, then pulled a cardboard file from his desk drawer. "I found something," Tom said, his voice taut. something that changes everything we thought we knew about what happened to Louise. My grandfather kept detailed records of his medical practice, including cases he wasn't proud of. I've avoided looking at these particular files because I suspected they might contain information that would tarnish his memory. Tom opened the folder and spread several documents across the desk. Catherine recognized the official letterhead of the Colorado State Psychiatric Hospital and what looked like medical records dated from the 1960s. Dr. Patterson, my grandfather, was paid to falsify Louise's commitment papers, Tom said quietly. But that's not the worst part. According to these records, Louise was never actually mentally ill. The Webb family paid Dr. Patterson to keep her sedated and confused, so she couldn't effectively contest her commitment. A wave of fury washed over Catherine, confirming what she had already suspected. But Tom's expression told her there was more. Catherine, there's something else. Something that's going to be very hard for you to hear. Tom pulled out a document that looked different from the others. Newer, with computer-printed text instead of typewritten pages. This is the death certificate for Louise Emma Hartwell, issued by the Colorado State Psychiatric Hospital 5 years ago. I know, Catherine said gently. I found a copy of the notification in the safe. Louise died in 2019. Tom shook his head. That's what I thought too, until I started comparing the details from my grandfather's records with the official death certificate. Catherine, the woman who died in that psychiatric hospital 5 years ago wasn't Louise Hartwell. Catherine stared at him, uncomprehending. What do you mean? Tom slid a photograph from his grandfather's files across the desk. A medical photo from 1960 showing a young woman with dark hair and frightened eyes. This is the woman who was admitted to the hospital as Louise Hartwell. But look at this. He placed a second photograph beside the first, one of the pictures Catherine had found in the barn, showing Louise with her baby. The women were similar, but as Catherine looked closer, she realized they were definitively different people. My grandfather's private notes reveal that the real Louise Hartwell was spirited away in 1960, likely to protect her from the Webb family's retribution. A mentally ill woman named Mary Sullivan was brought in to take her place, given Louise's identity, and committed to the hospital. Mary Sullivan lived in that institution for 59 years, dying in 2019, never knowing her real name or understanding why she was there. Catherine felt the room spin. Then where is Louise? Where is my mother? According to my grandfather's notes, Louise was taken to a safe place by people who were trying to protect her from the Webbs. But Dr. Patterson never recorded where she went or who was helping her. The identity swap was so complete that even Louise's own family believed she had been committed. Tom produced one last document, a handwritten letter by Dr. Patterson, apparently written as a confession near the end of his life. My grandfather was dying of cancer in 1995 when he wrote this. He was consumed by guilt for what he had done, and he wanted to leave a record of the truth. Catherine read the letter with trembling hands. Dr. Patterson wrote of being approached by Harrison Webb, who offered him a substantial sum to arrange Louise's commitment. But Patterson had also been contacted by another party, someone who offered him even more money to ensure Louise's safety. James Morrison had allies, the letter revealed. Someone with resources and influence was working to protect Louise and her child from the Webb family's reach. This person arranged for Louise's escape and the substitution of Mary Sullivan, but paid me to maintain the fiction that Louise was in the hospital to discourage further searching. Who? Catherine asked. Who was helping them? Tom shook his head. Dr. Patterson never identifies the person directly. He refers to them only as the benefactor and indicates that revealing their identity could endanger others who were being protected from similar situations. Catherine leaned back in her chair, trying to process the implications. If Louise had escaped in 1960 and had been living under protection for over 60 years, she could still be alive. Catherine might still have a chance to meet her biological mother. But Tom's expression suggested there was still more to the story. Catherine, there's one more thing. Something about your adoption that doesn't line up with the official records. He picked up a copy of Catherine's legal adoption papers, obtained from the county records. According to these documents, you were adopted by Robert and Emma Reeves in 1962, when you were 2 years old. But your birth medical records show that you were placed with the Reeves family shortly after your birth in 1960. What does that mean? It means someone spent 2 years creating a false paper trail to support the adoption. The Reeves family was likely part of the same network that was protecting Louise. People who were willing to take in and raise the children of women who had been targeted by the Webb family. Catherine thought of the quiet, gentle people who had raised her. Robert Reeves, with his kind manner and careful attention to her education. Emma, who was loving but always seemed to carry a sadness Catherine had never understood. Had they known the truth about her parentage all along? There's more, Tom continued. I found records indicating that the Reeves family received substantial financial support to care for you. Payments that came from an anonymous trust fund. Someone was ensuring that you received the best possible upbringing, and they were paying handsomely for it. The revelation explained things Catherine had never questioned as a child. The family's comfortable lifestyle despite Robert's modest income. The way money never seemed to be an issue when it came to her education or extracurricular activities. The trust fund that had allowed her to attend college without student loans. So, my entire life has been funded by this mysterious benefactor? It seems so. And Catherine, I think the benefactor is still active. The real estate transaction that brought you to Wyoming, I've been digging into it, and the financial arrangements are extremely unusual. The bank that foreclosed on the property and sold it to you is owned by a holding company I can't fully trace, but I suspect it's connected to the same network that has been protecting you your whole life. A chill ran down Catherine's spine as she realized the implications. Her decision to buy the property in Wyoming had not been a coincidence, not entirely her own. Someone had carefully orchestrated events to bring her to this place, at this time, with the resources and motivation to uncover the truth about Louise's disappearance. Someone wanted me to find this proof, she said slowly. Tom nodded. And I think they wanted you to find it now, specifically. Something has changed recently that makes it either safe or necessary for the truth to come out. Catherine thought of Marcus Webb's visit to her property, his obvious anxiety about her presence there. Maybe Louise's death 5 years ago, even if it wasn't really Louise, triggered something. Maybe the Webb family thinks they're finally safe because they believe Louise is dead. That would make sense. If they've been watching and waiting for 60 years, they may have decided the last witness to their crimes is gone. They might be planning something that would be much harder to pull off if the truth about their family's history became public. Tom gathered the documents and placed them back in the folder. Catherine, I think you're in considerable danger. If the Webb family finds out that Louise is still alive and that you have proof of their crimes, they won't just try to buy you off. They've killed to protect their secrets before. Catherine touched Louise's hospital bracelet in her pocket, thinking of the decades of sacrifice her mother had endured to protect the truth. Then we need to find Louise before they do. And we need to expose everything before they can silence us the way they silenced James Morrison. But even as she said the words, Catherine realized that finding Louise after 60 years in hiding might be impossible unless Louise wanted to be found. And given the elaborate network of protection that had sheltered her for so long, Louise might not even know that it was finally safe to come forward. The question was whether Catherine could unravel 60 years of carefully hidden truths before the Webb family realized their most dangerous enemy wasn't dead after all. Catherine and Tom spent the next 3 days planning their next steps with the careful deliberation of people who understood they were dealing with powerful enemies. Tom's revelation about Louise's escape had transformed their investigation from a search for family history into a race against time to protect a woman who had spent 60 years in hiding. Their priority was to find Louise, but decades of careful concealment made that task seem nearly impossible. Tom reached out to several genealogy researchers and private investigators, but the network protecting Louise was too sophisticated to have left any obvious trails. Meanwhile, Catherine noticed increasing signs that her property was under surveillance. Unfamiliar vehicles parked along the county road, strange clicks on her phone line, and scouts' increasingly agitated behavior whenever they neared the barn. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, the librarian who had first mentioned the Hartwell family, called Catherine on Thursday morning with information she had been reluctant to share before. "I've been thinking about our conversation," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice nervous. "There are things I knew but never spoke of because some secrets are too dangerous to unearth. But if Louise is still alive, she deserves to know that people remember her fondly." Mrs. Patterson asked Catherine to meet her at the library after hours, when they could talk in private. When Catherine arrived that evening, she found the elderly librarian surrounded by boxes of materials she had apparently retrieved from personal storage. "This belonged to my aunt, Sarah," Mrs. Patterson explained. "Sarah Fleming, who married James Morrison. After James died, Sarah never remarried, and she spent the rest of her life trying to understand what really happened to her husband. She became convinced that James was murdered because he discovered something dangerous about the Webb family." Mrs. Patterson opened one of the boxes, revealing letters, newspaper clippings, and photographs that Sarah Morrison had collected over decades of private investigation. Sarah knew about James's relationship with Louise, and she wasn't angry about it. Her marriage to James had been arranged by their families, and she understood that he had never loved her as a husband should. When Louise disappeared, Sarah suspected that the same forces that had destroyed Louise had also killed James. Catherine sifted through Sarah's materials, impressed by how systematically James's widow had documented her suspicions. Sarah had tracked the Webb family's business dealings, identified other families who were forced to sell their properties under suspicious circumstances, and even corresponded with lawyers who specialized in exposing corporate fraud. Sarah never had enough evidence to prove her theories, Mrs. Patterson continued. But she did discover something important. She found out that Louise wasn't taken to the Colorado State Psychiatric Hospital immediately after she disappeared. For several months, Louise was hidden in a safe place while long-term arrangements were made for her protection. Mrs. Patterson produced a photograph that took Catherine's breath away. It showed Louise Hartwell, obviously pregnant, standing beside a small log cabin with mountains visible in the background. Louise looked healthy and calm, not like someone who was mentally ill or being held against her will. Sarah traced this photograph to a cabin near Nederland, Colorado, in the mountains west of Boulder. It was owned by a family named Anderson, who were apparently part of some kind of underground network that helped women in dangerous situations. Sarah believed that Louise spent several months there after Catherine was born, recovering and making plans for the future. Catherine studied the photo, noting the date scrawled on the back, August 1960. That was 3 months after her birth, which meant Louise had been with her those crucial first months before she was forced to give her up. Did Sarah ever contact the Anderson family? Mrs. Patterson nodded. She went to Nederland in the 1970s and spoke with Martha Anderson, the woman who ran what they called a shelter for women fleeing abusive situations. Martha had confided in Sarah that Louise had taken refuge with them for nearly 6 months, but was later moved to an even more secure location when it became clear the Webb family was actively searching for her. Mrs. Patterson handed Catherine a note, written in Sarah Morrison's careful script. Martha Anderson had given Sarah the address before she died. It was where Louise had been taken for permanent protection, she'd said, but she had warned Sarah never to visit unless it was absolutely necessary, as it could put Louise's safety at risk. The address was in a small town named Millbrook, tucked away in the mountains of northern Colorado. Catherine had never heard of it, but Tom would later confirm that Millbrook was a community known for its privacy and the tendency of its residents to mind their own business. "There's one more thing," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Martha Anderson told Sarah that Louise wasn't the only woman they helped escape the Webb family's grasp. Apparently, Harrison Webb and his associates had been preying on young women from farming families for years, using various methods to force them into situations where they could be controlled or silenced. The revelation added a disturbing new dimension to the Webb family's crimes. They hadn't just targeted Louise and James. They had been running what amounted to a systematic campaign of exploitation and intimidation against vulnerable families across the entire region. Catherine left the library with copies of Sarah Morrison's research and a rising sense of urgency. If Louise was still alive in Millbrook, she would be over 90 now and might not have much time left. But Catherine also understood that approaching Louise directly could be dangerous for both her mother and herself. The following morning brought disturbing news. Tom called Catherine early to report that his office had been broken into during the night. Nothing obvious had been stolen, but his files had been rifled through, and the hard drive from his computer was missing. "They're getting desperate," Tom said. "I think they know we're getting close to something they can't afford to have exposed." Catherine's own property showed signs of a trespasser as well. Someone had been in the barn, though they had been careful not to disturb anything obvious. Scout was on edge, refusing to leave Catherine's side, his protective instincts clearly triggered by a threat he could sense but she could not fully grasp. That afternoon, Marcus Webb returned for another visit, this time flanked by two men who looked more like private security than legitimate businessmen. Webb's demeanor had shifted from politely menacing to openly hostile. "Mrs. Reeves, I don't think you appreciated the seriousness of our last conversation," Webb said, dispensing with any preamble. "This property sits on some very valuable mineral deposits, and Mountain Vista Development has invested considerable resources in acquiring the mineral rights for this entire area." Catherine stood in her doorway with Scout at her side, noting that the two men with Webb had positioned themselves to block her escape routes. "I'm not interested in selling my mineral rights," she replied. "I'm afraid it's not that simple," Webb continued. "You see, there are certain irregularities in your property's title history that could create significant legal complications for you. Documents that could call your ownership of this land into question entirely." The threat was barely veiled. Webb was implying he could fabricate legal challenges to Catherine's ownership, likely using the same tactics his family had employed against the Hartwells 60 years prior. Of course, these complications could be resolved quickly and discreetly if you were willing to cooperate with us, Webb went on. But if you choose to make things difficult, you could find yourself tied up in litigation that could drag on for years, spending money you don't have to defend a claim that may not be valid. Catherine kept her expression neutral, but her mind was racing. Webb's visit confirmed he was worried about what she might have discovered, but it also revealed something critical. He didn't know about the evidence she'd found in the safe, nor about Tom's discovery that Louise was still alive. "I'll consider your offer," Catherine said cautiously, "but I'll need some time to review the legal implications with my attorney." Webb's smile was cold. "Don't take too long, Mrs. Reeves. Market conditions can change very quickly, and our patience is not limitless." After Webb and his men departed, Catherine immediately called Tom and arranged to meet him at a diner in the next county, far from Pine Ridge and any potential surveillance. They needed to finalize their plan to find Louise and expose the Webb family's crimes before Marcus Webb escalated his threats to outright violence. At the diner, Tom spread out maps of northern Colorado and the research materials they had gathered. "I've been thinking about our approach," he said. "If we go into Millbrook and start asking questions about Louise, we'll draw attention that could put her in danger. But we need to warn her that the Webb family may be closing in." Catherine had been wrestling with the same problem. What if we don't go to Millbrook directly? What if we find a way to send Louise a message and let her decide if she wants to make contact? Tom nodded. "That's probably safer. But how do we send a message to someone who's been in hiding for 60 years? Catherine took out Louise's hospital bracelet, which she had carried with her since her trip to Denver. "We use something only Louise would recognize, something that proves we know who she really is, and that we don't work for the Webb family." They spent the evening crafting a careful message, one that would identify Catherine as Louise's daughter without revealing too much information in case it fell into the wrong hands. The message mentioned specific details from Louise's diary entries and included a photograph of the hospital bracelet. Tom agreed to drive to Millbrook the next day and drop the message at the local post office, addressed to Louise Anderson, the name she had likely been using since her arrival. They would include Catherine's phone number and ask Louise to make contact only if she felt it was safe to do so. But as Catherine drove home that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that events were moving too quickly for careful planning. Marcus Webb's visit had felt like an ultimatum, and she suspected his next approach would be far less civilized. She spent the night making copies of all the evidence she had gathered, storing them in multiple locations and preparing packages to send to journalists and law enforcement agencies should anything happen to her or Tom. If the Webb family was planning to silence her permanently, they would find that her death would only guarantee an even greater exposure of their crimes. As Catherine drifted off to sleep with Scout at the foot of her bed, she realized that the coming day would likely determine whether 60 years of carefully hidden truths would finally see the light, or if the Webb family would succeed in burying their secrets forever. Catherine was jolted awake at dawn by Scout's frantic barking. Through her bedroom window, she could see multiple vehicles approaching her property. Marcus Webb's SUV, followed by 2 work trucks carrying men who were most definitely not there for a social call. Scout's protective instincts were on full alert, and Catherine dressed quickly as she dialed Tom's number. "They're here," she said when a sleepy Tom answered. "Webb and at least 6 other men. This isn't a negotiation. They're planning to take the property by force." "Get out of there," Tom said urgently, Drive to the sheriff's office in Pine Ridge. I can't leave Scout, and there's no way I can get to my car without them seeing me. Catherine peeked through the curtain and saw the men spreading out across her property. Besides, I don't think Sheriff Morrison will be much help. His father was involved in the original cover-up. She'd uncovered the connection the night before while reviewing Tom's research. Sheriff Morrison was the son of James Morrison's cousin, making him part of a family that had both suffered from and potentially benefited from the Webb family's manipulations. Through the kitchen window, Catherine saw Marcus Webb approaching the front door, while his men took up positions near the barn and around the perimeter of her property. Scout stood at the door, his hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his chest that suggested he was ready to defend his territory against any threat. When Webb knocked, Catherine opened the main door, but kept the screen door locked between them. "This is harassment, Mr. Webb. I've already told you I'm not interested in selling." "I'm afraid the situation has changed," Webb said, dropping all pretense of civility. "We've discovered some serious irregularities with your purchase of this property that require an immediate investigation. I'm here with a court order authorizing us to search the premises for evidence of fraudulent documentation." Webb held up an official-looking document, but Catherine didn't need to examine it closely to know it was either a forgery or had been obtained through the same corrupt channels the Webb family had been using for decades. "You can search the property when my attorney is present," Catherine said firmly. "Until then, you are trespassing on private property." Webb's smile was glacial. "I don't think you understand the gravity of your situation. We have evidence that this property was purchased with funds obtained through illegal means, possibly involving identity theft and fraud. The authorities are very interested in speaking with you about your connection to these crimes." Catherine realized Webb was trying to frame her for crimes related to the mysterious trust fund that had supported her throughout her life. By claiming the property purchase was fraudulent, he could justify seizing the evidence she had discovered while painting her as a criminal rather than a victim. "I'm calling my lawyer," Catherine said, reaching for her phone. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Webb replied, nodding to one of his men. "We've had to disconnect your phone service as part of our investigation, and I regret to inform you that the county road leading to your property is temporarily closed for emergency repairs." Catherine understood that she was being isolated, that Webb's people had cut off her communications and her escape routes, but she also realized that Webb wouldn't have gone to such lengths unless he was desperate to stop her from sharing what she had discovered. "What do you want?" Catherine asked, cutting to the chase. "First, I want you to turn over all the materials you've collected during your illegal excavation of this property. Documents, photographs, personal items. Everything will serve as evidence in our investigation." Catherine thought of the hospital bracelet in her pocket and the copies of evidence she had hidden throughout the house. "And second, you will sign a statement acknowledging that your purchase of the property was fraudulent and that you are voluntarily relinquishing your claim to the land. In return, we will recommend that the prosecutors treat your case with leniency." It was a trap, designed to discredit Catherine and seize the evidence, making her a complicit party in the cover-up of the Webb family's crimes. But Catherine also recognized that Webb's urgency suggested something had changed in the last few days, something that made the exposure of the truth more dangerous to his family than ever before. "I need to see the court order," Catherine said, buying time as she tried to think of a way to contact Tom or alert authorities outside Pine Ridge. Webb passed the document to her through the screen door, and Catherine pretended to read it carefully, while actually observing the positions of his men. Two men were near the barn, likely looking for more evidence. Another was positioned near her car, ensuring she couldn't flee. The remaining 3 were spread out along the property's perimeter, watching for any approaching vehicles. As Catherine scanned the fraudulent court order, she noticed something that made her heart pound. The document was signed by a Judge Harrison Webb Jr., apparently Marcus Webb's brother or cousin, confirming that the Webb family's influence extended throughout the local legal system. But Catherine also noticed something else, a signature line at the bottom of the document that had not yet been filled in. The warrant was incomplete, suggesting Webb had brought it in the hopes of coercing Catherine into validating it by signing as a witness to the search. "This document isn't properly executed," Catherine said, looking up at Webb. "There's no witness signature, and the property description doesn't match my deed." Webb's expression hardened. "Those are technical details that can be corrected later. Right now, I need you to cooperate with our investigation." Catherine realized Webb's legal authority was as fraudulent as everything else about his operation. He was bluffing, hoping to intimidate her into turning over the evidence voluntarily, rather than risk exposing his family to the legal consequences of a blatantly illegal seizure. "No," Catherine said firmly. "I don't recognize your authority to search my property, and I won't be signing anything until I've spoken with my attorney." Webb stepped back from the door, his patience clearly gone. "Mrs. Reeves, you're making this much more difficult than it needs to be. My colleagues and I are going to search this property, with or without your cooperation. The only question is whether you choose to remain here while we do it." It was a direct threat of physical violence. Catherine knew that Webb had moved beyond legal intimidation into outright criminality. But she also realized his desperation might just create the opening she needed to expose his family's crimes once and for all. Just as Catherine was about to respond to Webb's threat, she heard the distant sound of vehicles approaching on the county road. Webb heard it too, and his expression shifted from confident intimidation to obvious concern. One of his men spoke into a radio, confirming that the arriving vehicles were not part of their operation. Through the window, Catherine could see a convoy of 3 vehicles approaching her property, led by Tom Brennan's familiar pickup truck. But the other vehicles were unknown. A sleek sedan with government plates and an SUV that looked like it belonged to state law enforcement. Webb stepped back from Catherine's door, his voice a harsh rasp into his own radio. "This was supposed to be contained. Who authorized access to this area?" The answer came not from his radio, but from one of the approaching vehicles. A woman, well into her 80s, emerged from the passenger side of Tom's truck. She moved with the careful dignity of one who had weathered decades of hardship, yet retained an unbreakable core of strength and resolve. Even from a distance, Catherine could see the resemblance, the same bone structure, the same elegant poise she remembered from the first photographs she had found. Louise Hartwell had come home. Webb's colleagues were visibly thrown by the development, shuffling on their feet, unsure whether to hold their positions or react to what was clearly an unexpected shift in the script. Webb himself seemed frozen, the dawning realization on his face that the careful plans his family had maintained for 60 years were suddenly, irrevocably, unraveling. Tom approached Webb as Louise walked directly toward the front door of Catherine's house, accompanied by a younger woman who carried the air of a legal representative. Scout's agitation immediately subsided, as if he recognized that these new arrivals represented rescue, not a threat. "Mr. Webb," Tom called out, his voice loud enough for everyone on the property to hear. "I believe you know Louise Hartwell Anderson. She's here to reclaim her family's property." Louise stopped directly in front of Marcus Webb, her posture erect, her voice clear despite her age. Marcus Webb, you have your father's face, the same face I saw when he destroyed my family 60 years ago. The color drained from Webb's face. Louise Hartwell died at the Colorado State Psychiatric Hospital in 2019. I have the death certificate. No, Louise said calmly. Mary Sullivan died in that hospital, after spending 59 years locked away under my name, because your father paid doctors to make me disappear. But I have been very much alive, waiting for the right moment to return. The woman accompanying Louise stepped forward, handing Webb an official-looking document. Mr. Webb, this is a federal court order authorizing the seizure of all Mountain Vista development properties, pending an investigation into charges including fraud, kidnapping, conspiracy, and racketeering. You and your associates are ordered to cease all activities on this property immediately. Catherine opened her front door and stepped out, finally seeing her biological mother clearly. Louise was shorter than Catherine had imagined, but her presence seemed to fill the space around her. When their eyes met, Louise offered a smile that was a complex mix of joy and sorrow, a reflection of 60 years of separation. Hello, Catherine, Louise said softly. I've watched you from a distance for most of your life. I am so proud of the woman you've become. Catherine walked toward her mother, Scout trailing protectively, as they embraced for the first time since Catherine was an infant. She could feel the weight of decades of hidden love and sacrifice in that single touch. How did you know to come here? Catherine asked, her voice thick with emotion. Tom found me yesterday and showed me your message, Louise replied. But more importantly, I've been waiting for this chance for years. When Mary Sullivan died in 2019, I knew it was finally safe for me to surface. The Webb family believed I was dead, which meant they would eventually make a mistake that would expose their crimes. Marcus Webb was speaking urgently into his radio, trying to coordinate some kind of response, but his associates were already backing away, unwilling to risk a confrontation with federal authorities. The legal representative explained that Louise had spent the last 5 years working with federal investigators to build a comprehensive case against the Webb family's criminal enterprise. The network that had protected Louise had also been gathering evidence of similar crimes committed against other families across the region. The Webb family has been operating what amounts to a criminal organization for over 60 years, the representative stated. They've used intimidation, fraud, and violence to acquire land and mineral rights across several states. Louise's case is just one of dozens we have documented. It dawned on Catherine that her decision to buy the property, to investigate her family's history, had been the catalyst that set this long-planned operation into motion. Someone in that protective network had guided her to this place, at this time, knowing her discoveries would provide the final proof needed to bring the Webbs down. Webb made one last, desperate attempt to maintain control. You have no authority here. This is a local matter involving property disputes, not federal crimes. Louise looked at him with the same calm dignity she had maintained throughout the confrontation. Marcus, your family stole my life, my daughter, and my family's legacy. But you made one crucial mistake. You let Catherine grow up to be the kind of person who doesn't back down when she knows something is wrong. Webb's radio crackled with reports of federal agents surrounding his other properties throughout the region. His family's criminal empire was crumbling in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As Catherine stood beside her mother, watching the Webb family's 60-year reign of intimidation come to an end, she understood that Louise's sacrifice had ultimately made this moment possible. By disappearing, she had protected not only herself and Catherine, but the very evidence that would finally bring justice. 3 months later, Catherine stood in the doorway of her barn, now transformed into the pottery studio she had first envisioned. But the space held far more meaning than she could have ever imagined when she first opened those weathered doors. Sunlight streamed through the enlarged windows, illuminating the workbenches where she shaped clay with the same hands that had unearthed her family's hidden history. Louise sat in a comfortable chair near the east-facing window, her fingers carefully sorting through a box of photographs and documents they had discovered in the barn's final secret compartment. At 88, she moved more slowly, but her mind was as sharp as ever, her determination undiminished. She had spent the last 3 months working with federal prosecutors to ensure every detail of the Webb family's crimes was properly documented. "Look at this one," Louise said, holding up a photograph Catherine had never seen. It showed a young James Morrison standing beside the newly built barn, his arm around a pregnant Louise. They were both smiling with the confident joy of people who believed their future was secure. Catherine took the photograph, studying it. "He built this barn for you, didn't he?" Louise nodded, her eyes glistening with memory. "He said it would be our sanctuary, a place where we could work side by side, building something beautiful and lasting. He was going to expand his ranching operation, and I was going to start a pottery business. We had so many plans." The barn had become a sanctuary, though not in the way James Morrison had intended. Instead of sheltering a family, it had preserved the evidence that would ultimately bring justice for the crimes committed against them. The irony was not lost on Catherine. The building, constructed as a symbol of hope, had become an instrument of reclamation. Outside, Scout patrolled the property with the quiet satisfaction of a dog who knew his territory was finally safe. The threats and surveillance that had marked Catherine's first weeks in Wyoming were now distant memories, replaced by the peaceful routine she had come here to find. The federal investigation led to the arrest and indictment of the entire Webb family, finally closing a dark chapter that had spanned 60 years.